Hey you guys, welcome to part 2 of my workshop with Strathmore. Now that we've learned the structures and the anatomy of the human face and the head, on this lesson we're gonna start to render and shade in the sketch that we made for the first one. And this is when we learn to really flesh out our shadings, and this time with the medium of the different shades in our pencils. The very key of rendering and shading your portraits with your pencils is to first understand the grades of the pencils, and I've explained this in lesson 1, but it's more important here for lesson 2, so we're gonna go over it again. So basically the H in your pencil stands for the hardness of the pencils, and so as the number in that H level goes up, the harder the pencils are gonna be. I really like using these for watercolor drawings when I want a very clean line work that I don't want to activate with my watercolors. I like using these harder pencils for that. But when I'm shading my sketches, and especially for portraits, I like to keep to the softer lead pencils, so that would be the pencils that are labeled B. And just like our H pencils, the B ones, as the numbers go up, the softer they are. And softer pencils tend to be a lot darker, so the softer the pencils are, the darker the values that you can get with them. So for this lesson, we're going to focus on choosing the right pencils, but also working in the values without using that many of them. So to render the sketch, I'm only going to use 3 pencils, and that will be my B pencil, which we're going to use for the lightest shading and the lightest highlights, our 2B pencil, which is the one that I used for the initial sketch, and then our 6B pencil, which we're going to use for the darkest shadows and the darkest values in our portrait. And so the first pencil that we're going to be using is our B pencil. And what we're going to do is use it to lightly hatch in the very brightest parts of the shadows. So we're going to start from our eyeballs. We're just going to go in from the very edge of it and make sure that it has enough depth within that eyeball for it to not look like a flat shape. Go in different directions to add in more depth, but again, just make sure that it's centered towards where the shadows are the darkest. Maybe add in some shading for her irises too. But once that's down, we're now going to do the same thing for the rest of her face. The only parts that we're leaving out are going to be the very, very brightest parts of the highlights. The rest of the drawing, we're basically going to go over with one single laydown of value. It may start to look flat just towards the beginning, but we're going to slowly start to build that up as we move along the painting. So right here between her eye and her nose, I'm just lightly marking out where I want the shadows to be first before slowly hatching that in one direction. And then when we go to the center of her nose, I'm actually marking out where I want the highlight to be instead of where I want the shading to be, and then shade around that. And while we're doing this, really make sure that we're being very light with our hatching. This is essentially the midtones, some of it even the parts of the highlights. So we just want to make sure that we're hatching it in sections, but also hatching it very, very lightly. We don't want to go too dark from the very beginning. So right here from the edge of her nostril, I want to do a second pass for it. But after that, we're going ahead to the rest of her face. Over here, it needs to go darker in values too, before we go into the bottom of her nose, and then even the curve above her lip, which you wouldn't think to add shadow there, but when you look at the reference photo, it's there, and it's just slightly shapes out her cupid's bow, so it's very important. And then once that's done, we're gonna go ahead and add this even flat value for her chin first, and then going up to curve her lower lip. And again, just make sure you're leaving out this highlight right here. There are also some smaller shadows, like beside her nostril right here and right under her eyes. Make sure those aren't left out too. Because these are the brightest parts of the shadows, essentially, it may look a little bit weird right now. And that's because we will be adding to it later on. As we go up in value, the whole picture will start to make more sense. Just make sure that you're marking out either the highlights or where we want the shading to be, so that when we're going at it in bigger areas, we don't leave out the highlights that we might miss. So especially right here towards the curve of her cheek, it's very important that we follow where her cheekbone ends and focus the shading right there. We don't want to make it too dark essentially, because we can always go darker later. But again, we are just making sure that we are making that area just the tiniest bit darker than the shading on her jaw, so we get that definition of her cheekbones. And then go ahead and add shading from different directions towards the darkest part of her jaw, which would be the very bottom. And then we'll be doing the same thing to her forehead. We're first gonna mark out the shading and where we want the highlights to be. And then we're gonna follow the contours of her head from where we can see the sketch was. So right here where that circle would end should be a little bit more flat than the one on her forehead. So we're adding a lot more shading there than where the round part of her forehead should be. And towards the center of her face too, right where her foreheads are, usually a lot more flat than the rest. So we're shading that in one pass before we go into the very edge where it should be darker from the angle that we're looking at it from. And then we're going to do the same thing to her neck, which should be slightly darker than her face. So we're mostly going over the whole thing except for the strip of highlights before we move on to her shoulder. And this is very rough. I'm just focusing on where the shadows should be on her shoulder. And I'm also going at it in different directions just so I can shape out the shading easier than if it was just one direction. Right here, I'm basically just going at it in one pass before moving on to the next layer of shading. So this is when we're gonna move on to our darker pencil, and this one is the 2B. And the first thing we're gonna do is shade out her lips. We're gonna start from the top one, and for that it's really just the whole thing. And for the bottom too, we want to make sure that we have this nice and even laydown of value before we add more depth to it. The idea really here is, since we're making her lips darker, that's why we're adding an even layer of darker value to it. Maybe add in a little bit more depth from the mouth line so that the shading makes it look like the lips are more rounded. Also want to make sure that the corners of her mouth is darker than the rest before we move into the shading on her nose. So right here, I want to make sure the darkest areas have more value to them. So her nostrils and the bottom parts of her nose before we go into add more shadow to the shadows that we've initially put in before. So her eyes right here, we're just adding more of a darker value to her eye bags and her eyelids. While I'm there too, I'm drawing in her lashes, maybe a little bit too long for the reference photo, but that's fine. We're just going to do the same thing for her eyebrows too. Really make sure now that we're drawing the hair strands in, which we didn't really pay attention to that much before. Just want to make sure now, as we're going up in value, that we're also going up in detail. So right here for her other eye, I'm making sure it has a lot more depth to the shadows around it too. So these are essentially the same places that we've shaded in before. Just now we're focusing them on the values that are a little bit darker than the first one. So you can see it really shapes out her nose more. But the way that the pencil is angled on the paper and the way that I'm holding it, it's a very similar way, but because the pencil is a lot darker, it creates a darker shadow. Just now adding the same lashes to this right one that I did on the left. And then again, I am going back to her eyebrow too. Just making sure it's a lot more defined than the first time. And we're doing the same thing to her eyes before going back into the shadows again. And once again, this is the same thing that we were doing before. But just this time, we're focusing the shading on the defining shadows of her face instead of the more even pass of shadow throughout the whole thing with the first layer. So now we're just darkening up the shadows that were already in there for the first layer. We're just making sure now that it's defining the shape of the face while we're doing it. Paying close attention to her ear right here too, making sure that its shadows aren't drowned out by the ones on her face. So now what we're gonna do is add an even layer for her hair, and you can really see right here the differences in the B pencil versus this 2B one, because I'm basically just doing the same thing as before and with the same amount of pressure, but you can still see how dark this even pass of value is compared to the ones for the first layer. This is also why it really helps to have different grades of pencils when you're rendering a pencil portrait, because you really see the difference right here because of that. So I'm just basically doing the same thing for her whole hair, and that's because we want the values for the hair to be a lot darker than her face, and that's why instead of just the whites of the paper as the brightest values for the hair, like the rest of the portrait, the ones that we're putting on right now will essentially be the highlights, and so it forces the other values to be a lot darker. So now we are going to be switching to our darkest pencil, which is our 6B, and we're going to focus it first on the darkest parts of the hair. And while we're shading this, we just want to make sure that it's following the flow of her hair. I want to make sure too that the shadows are the darkest right before it touches her face, because it creates that nice contrast between the lighter values of her face versus the darker ones for her hair. And I also think that it makes the shadows of her face a lot less harsh than before, because before we shaded in her hair, kind of looked like the shadows on her face were too dark, and now that we're adding in the darker values for her hair, what it did was just even the values out. So while we're shading in the hair too, we're also making sure that it's following the shadows that we see on the photo, like right here where the hair is tucked behind her ear should be a lot darker than the rest, and while it's there too, it should be following the flow of her hair from where it grows on her scalp. So you really just follow that same principle. When you're using a darker pencil, make sure that you're shading where the hair is growing from versus the shading that we were doing with the lighter pencil, which didn't really matter as much. But after we have all of the shading done on her hair, we are almost done with this sketch. What I'm doing right now is adding in the finishing details with the same darkest pencil that I have. Just making sure that I'm adding in the darkest details of her eyes to make sure they pop. Also maybe darken up some hair strands and clean up some lines, but after that, that will be it for this one. So I hope I explained the principles of rendering a portrait with pencils for this one, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, and I will be seeing you guys again for the next one when we do it with watercolors.